The Underground Railroad in Cass County, Middle School Edition. Slavery means owning another person and making them work for you for free. We had slaves right here in our country for hundreds of years. A slave belonged to his or her master and could not leave. They had nothing to call their own, not even their last name. They took the name of their white master and worked for him in the fields or his house until they died. Children of slave women were also slaves and belonged to the master. A master could buy and sell slaves as he liked, just like animals. Families were often torn apart and sold to different masters. A master could punish slaves whenever he wanted to, mostly by whipping. Slaves often had to wear chains around their wrists, ankles, or even their necks to make sure they didn't run away. They were forbidden to learn to read and write, but some slaves found a way to learn anyway. The first slaves were taken from Africa in 1619. They were sold to slave traders who took them in filthy, crowded ships across the ocean and sold them to slave owners in America. At first, there were slaves everywhere here, but by the 1800s, the United States divided into the northern free states who didn't have slaves, and that's the yellow part of the map, and the southern slave states who bought and sold slaves and forced them to work and wouldn't let them leave. The slave states are the orange part of the map. The stripes signify places that weren't states yet, and they could either be slave or free. The reason our country divided into free states and slave states is that the South needed free workers to harvest cotton, tobacco, and rice on big farms called plantations. The northern states had more factories and businesses and didn't need people to work for free. From the start, slaves wanted to be free. Many would run away time and again, chased by dogs and slave catchers, and return to their masters to be punished severely. But some slaves were freed by their masters, or someone else bought the freedom for them. Some found a way to earn money and bought their own freedom. Some served in the army and were given their freedom. Those with a white mother and a slave father were born free. These people were known as free blacks, and they had to carry papers all the time to prove they were free and not slaves. If they didn't have their papers, they could be sold into slavery. Abolitionists were people who thought slavery was wrong and wanted it to end. Some abolitionists published newspapers and went around speaking about how evil slavery was. Others decided to help slaves who wanted to run away by hiding them in their homes, barns, and other places. Even though the northern states were free, a law called the Fugitive Slave Act allowed slave owners to take back their slaves no matter where they were. So most slaves wanted to get to Canada because that whole country was free and slave catchers were not allowed in. Many people decided to help slaves get to Canada by taking them from safe place to safe place until they reached freedom. Quakers are a religious group who hated slavery. They moved from southern slave states to northern free states to get away from it. They were the first to help slaves by hiding them and taking them to the next hiding place. Soon this became known as the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad wasn't underground and it wasn't a railroad. It was a way for escaping slaves to get to Canada by hiding in houses, barns, and other places. It was called underground because it was secret, and railroad because it carried them to freedom. A candle in the window showed that it was a safe place to stop for help. Slaves were hidden in the attic, basement, and other places in the house, and often in the barn or other buildings on a farm. So the Underground Railroad wasn't underground or a railroad. It was many secret routes north that escaping slaves could use to find freedom. These routes were called lines, and now we call escaping slaves freedom seekers. This map shows some of the lines that freedom seekers used to get to Canada. Places where freedom seekers could get food and shelter were called stations. People that provided food and shelter were called station masters. Those who took freedom seekers to the next station, usually 12 to 20 miles away, were called conductors. Freedom seekers would walk to the next station or be hidden in wagons. They sometimes were put on ships or trains to reach freedom in Canada. The Underground Railroad ran from 1830 to 1861 when the Civil War started. A large group of Quakers settled in the area around Vandalia in the 1830s. Some of them decided they wanted to help freedom seekers get to Canada by being part of the Underground Railroad. There were two lines of the Underground Railroad that ended in Cass County. One came up through Indiana to Bristol to Vandalia. The other came up through Illinois to Niles to Vandalia. Stephen and Hannah Bogue, James E. and Sarah Bonine, William Jones, and Ishmael Lee were Quaker station masters on the Underground Railroad. Their homes were stations, and freedom seekers were hidden there. The Bonine house at Penn Road and M60 wasn't a station, but the Bonine carriage house across the street was a station. Zachariah Sugar and Henry Shepherd were conductors that took freedom seekers to the next station. That was the home of Dr. Nathan and Pamela Thomas in Schoolcraft. Then freedom seekers went to the home of Erastus and Sarah Hussey in Battle Creek, and on to other stations until they reached Detroit, where they crossed the river into Canada. There they were free at last. Many free blacks began arriving in Cass County in the mid-1840s. Stewart, Lawson, Allen, Hawks, Ash, Sanders, Bird, Connor, Anderson, and many other free black families purchased land, mostly in Calvin Township, and began farming. They founded Chain Lake, Mount Zion, and Bethel churches, and played an important role in helping freedom seekers on their journey. Most freedom seekers went on to Canada, but some stayed for a time to work on Quaker farms. Perry Sanford and his group arrived in April 1847 and were staying in a cabin on the Stephen Bogue farm. In August, 13 slave catchers came from Kentucky to bring Perry and other freedom seekers back. They kidnapped freedom seekers on the Osborne, East, and Sugar farms. Then they came for Perry and his friends at the Bogue farm. Perry escaped out the roof and went to warn Stephen Bogue, who went to Cassopolis to get help. Hannah Bogue hid Perry upstairs in their house, where he could see everything that was going on outside on the street. All the slave catchers and kidnapped freedom seekers went to Odell's Mill, which is where the park is in Vandalia. Hundreds of people surrounded them and said they couldn't take the freedom seekers back to Kentucky. They all went to court in Cassopolis. The judge, Ebenezer McIlvaine, was a secret abolitionist, and he let the freedom seekers testify against the slave catchers. The freedom seekers won, and the slave catchers went home empty-handed and very angry. All the freedom seekers escaped on the Underground Railroad. Perry Sanford stayed in Battle Creek and told a newspaper reporter all about the Kentucky raid many years later. After the Kentucky raid, slave catchers knew they would have a hard time getting their slaves back, so they stopped coming here so often. In 1853, James E. Bonine purchased land west of Calvin Center and just south of M60, and invited freedom seekers and free blacks to come here. He lent them 10 acres of land, and in exchange for clearing it, they could build a cabin, plant a garden, earn their own money, and send their children to school and go to church. This became a community of about 30 cabins that came to be called Ramptown, after a wild leek that still grows in the area. Many people earned enough to purchase their own farms. It was an arrangement that worked for everyone. Ramptown lasted to about 1900, but all the cabins are gone now. In 1861, we went to war to decide if we would have slavery in our country or not. The North, or Union, fought to end it, and the South, or Confederacy, fought to keep it. At first, black men couldn't be soldiers, but in 1863, Abraham Lincoln allowed them to join, and they fought bravely in many battles. Over 100 men from Cass County, mostly from Calvin Township, joined the 102nd Colored Troops. They are buried in Chain Lake, Mount Zion, and Bethel cemeteries. Shown here are 102nd reenactors who come to Underground Railroad Days every year. By 1850, there were many one-room schools in this area. Black and white children went to school together in Penn and Calvin townships. Here's a photo of Brownsville School that's still standing, and Long School that sadly burned down. URSCC was formed to tell the story of the Underground Railroad in Cass County and to restore the Bonine House and the Carriage House. You can see these buildings, as well as many others we talked about today, on our driving tour. You can download a map from our website, urscc.org, or pick one up in the park in Vandalia, which is where the tour begins. You can visit the Bonine House and Carriage House from June through September. We'll take you on a tour, and you can go to the top of the tower in the Bonine House. You can rub Lucky the Lion's nose for luck. You can learn lots more about the Underground Railroad in our library and our display rooms. And in the Carriage House, you can see a wagon just like those that carried freedom seekers to the next station. We hope you bring your family to the Wax Museum in the spring, to Underground Railroad Days the second weekend in July, and Christmas at the Bonine House the first 2 weekends in December. We promise you'll have fun. You can learn lots more about URSCC and the Underground Railroad in Cass County on our website, urscc.org. Also, please visit us on Facebook. Thank you. Hope to see you soon.